Center for American Progress Action Fund for the release of Change for America, a progressive blueprint for the 44th president. Today we're releasing part of the book online. 10 chapters will be available free of charge on our Center for American Progress Action Fund website. The book also is going to be published by Basic Books and will be available in the bookstores in January 2009. The Center for American Progress Action Fund and Mark Green of the New Democracy Project began this effort about a year ago. We recognize that the 2008 transition could be the most important ever, given the economic turmoil and the national security challenges our nation faces. Our goal was to bring together the best progressive policy minds to jumpstart the transition process and to help steer the new government in a new, more progressive direction. We enlisted over 60 policy experts, former government officials, and academics to provide advice and recommendations about what the new administration should do on day one, in the first 100 days, over the first year, and then over the longer term. We were not looking for a laundry list of ideas, but rather a set of priorities and recommendations that were realistic and actionable for the new president and his team. The result is Change for America, a book with over 55 chapters covering all of the major agencies and top policy priorities for the new president. The book begins with an important section on the structure and workings of the White House. The recommendations include restoring a functional, strong, and effective interagency process at the NEC, revitalizing the NEC to ensure that it is once again an effective coordinator and honest broker, and establishing a limited number of new White House offices that reflect the president's new priorities, including energy, social innovation and entrepreneurship, and technology. The next section of the book provides recommendations for how to stimulate economic growth and to be sure that all Americans are benefiting from that growth. We have recommendations for the immediate term on how the new president should deal with the continuing global financial and economic crisis. And we have recommendations for how to address the longer term challenges, for how to address things like economic mobility and to promote transformation to a low carbon economy. Our first panel is going to deal with some of those issues. The third section provides a broad overview of the domestic landscape, focusing especially on how to promote a stronger democracy, dealing with the challenges and opportunities of our nation's changing demographics, promoting energy independence and green jobs, and ensuring that all Americans have access to health care. The final section presents a new national security strategy for the incoming president focused on fighting terrorist threats, ending the war in Iraq, ensuring a strong and secure homeland, promoting greater global economic development, and a renewed focus on human and civil rights and diplomacy in a new security environment. Our panels today will be highlighting some of the key recommendations in each of these areas. While some of our panelists and our authors may be involved in the official transition, I want to make clear now that they're not speaking for the transition or representing the transition. The views that they express are their own. I also want to thank the many authors who contributed to this project. Not all of them could be here today, but I know some of them are here. Virginia Cox, Peter Edelman, Christine Varney, Fred Hochberg, Larry Irving, Max Steyer, Doug Wilson, Cy Lazarus, and Jonathan Salet, and Tom Friedman. We really appreciate all of the enormous contributions you made in drafting these chapters. It was a lot of time and a lot of hard work, and it's made a huge contribution to our effort. I also want to say thank you to the entire team at the Center for American Progress Action Fund. The staff, fellows, communications and outreach teams, as well as our editorial team, played an enormous role in developing the content of this book. And a special thank you to Ed Paisley, who is the Vice President for Editorial at the Center for American Progress Action Fund. He worked tirelessly to help make this book what it is. And a thank you to our Managing Director of this project, Sam Davis, who managed all the moving parts with great patience and skill. And finally, a big thank you to our partners, Mark Green and the New Democracy Project, for your great creativity and for helping us draw on some of the great progressive leaders to make this project what it is. Mark?
Good morning. Thank you all for being here at this potentially historic synapse for Washington and America, potentially a transition certainly between presidencies and potentially between eras. First, I really want to thank, as Michelle has kindly done, Michelle, Sarah, Ed, Sam, and the entire team at the CAP Action Fund for performing exactly as I had hoped and anticipated when we began, given their quality and the quantity of work that was done. Frankly, I don't know who else could have pulled this off. Also, if I may, a thank you to people who contributed resources and content over time. Doug Wilson and the Howard Gilman Foundation, Gail Furman, Doug Phelps, and the Fund for Public Interest Research, Thomas Hilbink and the Open Society Institute, and especially my colleague, Lauren Strayer, the Executive Director of the New Democracy Project, for her substantive and skilled work over 18 months, including her essay on the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I've been asked periodically how this baby got conceived. Over a year ago, before he had to, of course, recuse himself, I called John Podesta and asked if he wanted to collaborate on a nonpartisan, agency-by-agency transition report for whoever became the 44th president at a time when, of course, no one could have known who would prevail. And the reason was that the Center for American Progress was the premier progressive think tank in Washington. And I had done a version of this in 91 and 92 with the encouragement of then Governor Bill Clinton. So we agreed to be co-partners and then organized with Michelle and then Melody Barnes and everyone else, scores of scholars, advocates, activists, officials to produce this 300,000 word, but who's counting? The answer is our publisher was counting. Word report called Change for America. It turns out that in the Bush-Cheney years, there were numerous experts in the policy wilderness who were doing great work, in a sense, waiting to be harnessed and combined for that moment when attention shifted from politics to policies. And that moment is now. As Michelle noted, this volume has hundreds of solutions and proposals for the next president, next administration, next Congress. But Change for America is not a mere list. For our thematic goal from the start was to ground all our proposals in 4 core values: democracy, diplomacy, economic opportunity, and a greener world. Given where we are in 2008 and given the inherited problems of a narrowed democracy, economic decline, 2 wars, a corrupted environment, a contempt for law, we thought it important to root our solutions in these 4 common values. In my view, they comprise a holistic program for progressive patriotism. I mean, what can be more patriotic than progress, which is the American hallmark? As Whitman wrote, America is always becoming. So it's time not just to wave the flag, but to act on and live up to her principles. That's what progressive patriotism attempts to do. So while a transition team or any of you or any citizen can determine which solutions you think are the most momentous and needed, Change for America is not a catechism. It's a menu. Now, from my one perspective, here are highlights organized around these 4 principles, and which are in my summarizing and synthesizing introduction. First, a stronger democracy. As our second panel will discuss, when the mechanism of democracy is broken, when there's such secrecy and disenfranchisement and lawlessness and special interest sway that average people really can't get heard, then government can't act, doesn't know how to act in the public interest. So it's an ideal time to push for universal voter enrollment, a criminal ban on voter suppression, congressional campaign finance reform, national standards for electronic voting and for voter disenfranchisement laws, and a new office or impute to an existing office you can call it a democracy czar, urging all these reforms within the government as the president's emissary. Value 2, economic opportunity, because real income for middle-class workers for the first time in several generations has actually declined in real terms these 8 years. The 44th president should focus on an economic growth but economic opportunity program as well. And as discussed throughout the book, that includes actually restoring the progressive tax code, increasing enrollment of children in the Children's Insurance Program, moving toward a Medicare for all version of universal health insurance, emphasizing universal pre-K, so all our children are ready to learn, and enacting an Employee Free Choice Act, so labor unions, about the best mechanism for raising real wages, stop losing out to anti-union company campaigns. Value 3, diplomacy for security, At the end of World War II, Churchill and FDR certainly understood the concept of collective security for democracies. And because problems today of pollution and AIDS and other pandemics and refugee flows and terrorism sure don't comply with national boundaries, we need an effect to sign on to a declaration of interdependence. So we quit Iraq, close Guantanamo, stop torture, convene a regional alliance in the Middle East so Iraq doesn't blow up again, and construct and lead a new alliance of states against terrorism that focuses on intelligence and police work rather than preventive invasion, so-called, of sovereign states. And fourth and last value, a greener world. Given the calamitous consequences of extreme weather and human-made climate change, America needs to move to a green economy that alone can simultaneously attack three separate problems: job growth, pollution, and national security. The only way to serve as a model for developing and polluting megastates like China, like India, is to build a green consciousness into every economic decision, every transportation decision, every regulatory decision. So that means creating a new White House National Energy Council, discussed in detail in the book, with the stature of a National Security Council, a cap-and-trade program, stricter auto fuel efficiency standards, a plan to develop a new line of ultra-efficient vehicles like plug-in hybrids, and a requirement to increase electricity generated from renewables. Michelle and I in the first panel will be available to answer questions from the media at the close of the next panel. But I'd like now to turn to the four panels, each with several contributors, who will themselves summarize their best solutions, because our volume looks ahead, not backward, is about solutions rather than just a description of what has gone wrong, organized around economic opportunity, democracy, diplomacy for security, and finally a greener world. But with that, could the four panelists on economic growth and opportunity please come forward?
So much for being here. I'm Sarah Rosenwortel. I'm the acting CEO of the Center for American Progress and Executive Vice President at the Center for American Progress Action Fund, in which capacity I'm here today. I see many friends in the audience, and I also see a number of other chapter contributors who I think even didn't make Michelle's list. Some folks may have come in we weren't expecting. We're really pleased to see everyone, and I cannot say how much on behalf of New Democracy and the Center for American Progress Action Fund, how grateful we are to all the people who put their time and energy. I know from personal multiple rounds of edits how much effort in late hours around day jobs people spent, and we're really grateful. This panel is going to focus a little bit on some of the recommendations in the book that come out of out of the economic agenda. And Mark laid out some of the principles, and we'll talk a little bit more about them. We're lucky to have three of the authors here. Let me introduce everyone at the start so we can go quickly through it. We have Jean Lambrou, who is both a senior fellow at the CAP and an associate professor of public affairs at the LBJ School at the University of Texas. She was a senior health policy leader in a variety of positions in the Clinton White House. Her chapter is on HHS and contributed also to the overview on health policy. Michael Barr, also a senior fellow at CAP and a professor at the University of Michigan Law Center, was an official in the Clinton administration in the Treasury Department. Judith Winston was formerly general counsel and undersecretary at the Department of Education, also formerly a law professor at American University. She contributed a chapter about the Department of Education. Of course, on the economic agenda, there are many other authors whose work is reflected today. Let me just mention a couple of the others. Laura Tyson, formerly the NEC and CEA chairs, and a CAP senior fellow, does a chapter on competitiveness and trade. Ed Montgomery, formerly the deputy secretary at the Department of Labor, has a chapter about that department. Peter Edelman of Georgetown Law, formerly at HHS, and Angela Glover-Backwell, two of whom co-chaired a CAP poverty task force in 2007, wrote a chapter about restoring economic mobility. Gene Sperling has a chapter on what a progressive economic agenda looks like. Gene will be speaking at a separate program here this afternoon at CAP. That program talks a little bit more about this ambitious agenda that's reflected in this book, how it can start to get to get accomplished and how quickly we can move ahead on its various pieces in light of the very difficult economic circumstances the country finds ourselves. And there'll be a discussion there today about why all of this needs to proceed, probably even with greater urgency and alacrity than we had first envisioned because of the difficult circumstances the country finds itself in. I'm going to just very quickly provide you an overview of what all of these different economic chapters and others I haven't mentioned are really getting at, and then turn to the panelists. There's a piece that's laid out in our website today. It was did not make the book. There was a number of other chapters like that that did not make the book that, as our 300,000 words, was about the patience of our publisher and how much people want to carry around with them when the thing is printed. But this, in some ways, is a distillation of what's in all of the economic agenda. And what it really is sort of how I think the new president's economic agenda will be measured from history. They're the goals, the high-level goals that all of these policy recommendations Mark mentioned and we'll talk about here today are aimed at achieving. And they're what I hope, and as John and I argue in our White House chapter, in part should be the kind of the lodestar, the reference point that people stop, as crazy as life is inside the White House, you stop every once in a while and say, does it look like we're making progress in what we really set out to do? Sure, there'll be 100 problems we can't even imagine today, and some that we didn't imagine when some of us were writing these chapters only 5-6 months ago. But at the end of the day, we know what the key issues, the economic agenda of this president will be judged by, I believe. So the first is whether the country grows. And as Mark pointed out, it's not simply growth that we aspire to. We've seen an economy that grew relatively well over the last 8 years, but a very small portion of our population benefit from that growth. So is this growth driven by the recommendations in the innovation chapter, in the green revolution chapter, and many others? Is this growth that is widely shared and benefits many in our society? Another thing which is implicit in that is not only that we provide a level of economic security for the American public, but also economic mobility. The core idea of what it means to be American in this country is that people have a chance of getting ahead and that their children have a better future than they had. And yet for the last 8 years, that's really begun to disappear. And in fact, there's some longer term trends. Americans fundamentally understand that they live in a global world that's different, and no one has offered a strategy for the country's success, for our firm's success, and for our citizens' success in that world. Are people once again believing that they and their children face a brighter future? The transformation to a low-carbon economy, it's thought of not only as an energy policy, but as a driver of growth and essentially a necessary change, because if not, we can't restore confidence in an economy if people see the enormous costs of inaction that we're potentially going to face. A responsible fiscal policy, and in today's environment that needs to be understood differently than perhaps those buzzwords mean. Absolutely, we need to be doing some investment now in the short term in making these opportunities and growth possible in the long term. But two, we need to be willing to scrub the federal government, invest our resources in the things that are most important to growth, be willing to make choices about relative effectiveness of programs and tax expenditures, and on the long term, find a path towards restoring balance. And that will also be discussed further at the afternoon panel today. A competitive America, one, as I said before, that has a real possibility for being a global leader, both economically and around the world. Global prosperity and sustainable security. Our role in the larger global economy has been demonstrated rather painfully over the last few months, but we can become an engine of expanding economic opportunity, helping to build broad middle classes in countries around the globe, and that's ultimately good for us. And then finally, a stable global financial system. Those are some of the large goals that we believe the policy recommendations in this book advance, and which at the end of the day, when we're looking back on the Obama administration, not only 8 years from now, but perhaps decades from now, we hope that if these recommendations are able to move forward, we'll be able to say there was progress. I know that Jean is drawn in a couple different places today, running around to Capitol Hill. So we're going to ask her to go first on health care, and then she needs to run right out, and we'll move forward from there to Michael and then to Judith.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And I also want us to thank Michelle and her team for putting together an excellent book. my colleagues here at CAP, who really did contribute to the ideas, as well as my colleagues around town, who really have thought hard about how do we think about executive actions in healthcare. And begin with caveats that might have been said before, but first, my chapter was written about 6 or 8 months ago, which is a long time ago, before there was a real transition of power, real actors. It was written as in my academic hat, thinking about these ideas, and has absolutely no standing in the real world. It was also written before we actually had a sense of the scope of the challenges we face now. I mean, 8 months ago, we couldn't imagine the type of economic crisis that we're in right now. And this does raise the urgency and the need to stabilize our health system as well as to address its long-run problems. The Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS, is well positioned to help meet these challenges. Its budget comprises nearly a quarter of all federal outlays, second only to the Department of Defense in its size. It contains 11 agencies, 20 offices within the Office of the Secretary, 300 programs, and hires about 50,000 employees. In addition to being a dominant force in the executive branch, HHS funds a fair amount of our national health spending. About 35% of our total $2.6 trillion is funded at the federal level, meaning that it's a real player when we think about our healthcare system. So while Congress does set the parameters for most of HHS's activities, the department has considerable ability to influence policy through regulatory actions, guidance, and oversight. In our chapter, I focus on how the Secretary of HHS, working with the incoming president, could address some of the health system's most pressing problems. Here I highlight 5 of those options that address immediate, short-term, and long-term priorities. First, the administration could lift constraints on coverage in the state children's health insurance program. Despite a growing uninsured population, the Bush administration implemented a number of executive branch policies that limit states' abilities to expand Medicaid and S-chip coverage. Most notably, there was guidance called the August 17th Directive that limited states' ability to expand coverage and maintain coverage for middle-income children. The new secretary could rescind this August 17th directive. Second, the secretary, working with the administration, could strengthen consumer protections in Medicare's private plans. The Bush administration made encouraging greater private plan participation in public programs a priority. The law that authorized both changes in drug policy and Medicare Advantage left many of the policies regarding consumer protections to the discretion of the agency. The new secretary could direct the administrator of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services to issue guidance to clarify and prevent discrimination against people with illness, strengthen marketing guidelines, and ensure that there's really truth in advertising. Third, an incoming administration could promote information access and scientific integrity and data-driven policy. Increasingly, the United States' global leadership is due less to our natural resources and manufacturing strength than our innovation and conversion to an information-based economy. This applies in the health sector. However, in numerous instances, the Bush administration has proved hostile to medical and health services data and research. The incoming secretary could take a number of steps to reinvigorate HHS's scientific integrity. One such step is clarifying data access and release policies to ensure patient privacy protected access to information so that we can really get at issues like the racial disparities in our system. A fourth potential action is to prioritize prevention. Preventable chronic diseases are this century's epidemic. About 70% of deaths and 78% of costs are due to chronic illnesses, many of which are preventable. The new Secretary of Health and Human Services could take immediate steps to make prevention a priority. He or she could create a new council or center or agency to signal its importance and try to concentrate the decision-making authority. We here at the Center for American Progress have an idea called the Wellness Trust that could begin to be implemented through executive actions. And fifth, you can imagine that the new secretary could try to prepare for some of our longer-term challenges. And one of those is creating a 21st century healthcare workforce. We certainly know we need to invest in health information technology or the hardware of the system, but we also need to focus on what's called the software of the system. That is people's ability to deal with information, deal with the types of changes in our research, and really deliver care to a changing demographic. The secretary could review existing programs that promote workforce development. He or she could look at our Medicare policies to try to direct them towards the type of workforce we need. We also can begin to look beyond our traditional healthcare workers, at community health workers, for example, to try to achieve the goals like full use of high-value preventive services. This is a short list of the possible priorities the next secretary could undertake. There's many others: improving preparedness, advancing quality, shoring up the safety net. These are all different priorities the next secretary could and should address. But I'll just end by saying that the department has both the capacity and the authority to advance the goals of an affordable, high-quality, and accessible healthcare system. The opportunity is there for the next secretary's taking. Thank you.
Michael.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to Michelle and Mark and the other people who have been involved in this organization, which is quite a mammoth task. I was given the unenviable role of summarizing, commenting on, analyzing, and suggesting reform with respect to the financial and housing crisis that we're currently in. And Mark generously gave me 8 pages to do that in the book. What I want to focus on today is a little bit of background on the current crisis, some suggestions for long-term strategies, and then a discussion of the current crisis and how we might get out of it. As all of you are painfully aware, we are in the midst of a severe financial crisis on a global scale. There has been a vicious downward spiral begun really with an asset implosion in the housing sector that spread to the commercial sector as well. That asset implosion cascaded through our financial system. There was contagion from healthy institutions from weak institutions to healthy institutions. We're in the midst of a significant credit freeze. We've seen dramatic and real harm to the real economy. And during the course of this crisis, to state the obvious, major financial institutions have failed, disappeared from the landscape, and the risk of global financial crisis remains significantly high. What are the origins of this crisis? Excessive leverage and risk concentration that were permitted to occur because of lax regulation, lack of prudential supervision, lack of transparency, lack of real capital requirements outside of federally insured depositories in the banking system that led to this enormous leveraging. We saw a dramatic increase in financial innovation during this period that had many advantages. Financial innovation in securitization, in the derivatives markets, in hedging markets, that significantly expanded the liquidity of our financial system. At the same time, that financial innovation, because it was not accompanied by appropriate regulation, supervision, and capital requirements, drove and broadened a wedge between the incentives facing different players in our financial system: borrowers, lenders, rating agencies, investment banks, investors, securitizers, mortgage brokers. The incentives facing those institutions and individuals broadened significantly. And as a result, serious conflicts of interest drove a leveraging in the system and an excessive risk concentration in the system that we're living with today. The lack of transparency and oversight that we experienced during this period, coupled with rising asset prices before the bubble burst, hid these conflicts of interest, leveraging, and risk concentration for a good period of time. That is obviously no longer the case, no more. So we need some fundamental changes in our financial system. Let me just highlight a few. First, we need transparency, prudential supervision, and real capital requirements applied thoughtfully across the financial sector, not simply to banks, not simply to broker-dealer affiliates of investment banks, not simply to subcomponents of financial conglomerates, but really thoughtful prudential supervision, regulation, capital requirements, transparency that reach across our financial sector. Second, we need to fill what the late Federal Reserve Governor Ned Gramlich called the giant supervisory hole in the safety net. And by that I mean supervision of non-bank interactions with customers, with real people in the real world. During this crisis, mortgage brokers and lenders were able to offer to sell to homeowners products that made no sense for them, that were designed to fail from the start. And that's the reason that we had an asset bubble in housing, and it's the reason that we've had a crash. We need to fill that hole. Third, we need to understand that the market-based systems we had designed, we thought were in place, the gatekeeper system we thought we had in place, the reputation system we thought we had in place to prevent this growing wedge in incentives facing different participations in the system was an illusion, did not exist, did not function. And we need to have in place a regulatory system that ensures that those incentives are appropriately aligned. Let me focus in particular on one area where we might align the incentives better in the mortgage origination process. And in this area, I think we have an enormous opportunity with the new administration to put in place a new approach to regulation of mortgages. For example, we could learn some of the lessons from behavioral economics and psychology about how human beings actually make decisions in the world and act in the world. And we can use those lessons and apply them to the mortgage market. For example, what if we had in place an opt-out home mortgage system? Here's how it would work. You go to see your broker or your lender. You're signed up for a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage with straightforward terms and clear underwriting. And that's the mortgage you'd get unless you opted out. We'd have a system protect against problems with the opt-out, but our basic idea would be to give the opportunity for homeowners to have a mortgage that they can understand and afford. We need to repair the broken trust in our financial system by having trusted advisors play the appropriate role. We don't want mortgage brokers selling consumers loans in order to get the highest possible return through yield spread premiums. We want to have a system in which the broker has a fiduciary duty to the borrower to act in their best interests. So there are a handful of these ideas in the mortgage area. Let me just last say, we're in the midst of this financial crisis. There are things we need to be doing now while we're planning for these long-term changes. And let me just highlight two. One is something that the administration can do right now. The administration has been quite slow, the current administration has been quite slow to act in helping troubled home owners. And what we need to do is now turn our attention full bore to that problem. The FDIC, for example, has a plan to offer guarantees on restructured mortgage loans to servicers in exchange for services doing real loan modifications. I think that's a promising approach using existing authorities. The administration could act now and implement that now and start helping homeowners now. The second major change we need to put in place is a way to unlock mortgages that are held in securitization trusts. Most of the troubled mortgages today, most of the mortgages that are failing today, are held in privately structured securitization trusts. They're stuck in there. They can't be modified appropriately because of limitations in the servicing agreements. Together with colleagues at CAP, we've come up with something called the Safe Loan Plan to unlock those securitization trusts through a change to the Real Estate Mortgage Investment Conduit Statute that would incentivize servicers to act in the interest of both their investors and troubled homeowners by restructuring mortgage loans. And I'm hopeful that Congress will take up that proposal in the nearest possible term. So we're in this crisis now. We need to take immediate steps to get out of it. We need to start putting in place these long-term plans for restructuring our mortgage system and really fundamentally rethinking our financial services regulation across the financial services landscape. Thank you very much.
Judy, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Sarah. I want to also thank the Center for American Progress, Mark Green and Michelle Jolin, first of all, for both conceiving and producing this volume, and I'm delighted to be a part of the production and authoring this chapter on the Department of Education. I start with the premise that notwithstanding the principles of federalism that often pit Department of Education proponents against those opposed to federal involvement in education beyond funding, that is. The new president and the U.S. Department of Education, for the sake of the nation's national security and economic prosperity, must occupy a central role in ensuring high-quality, affordable, and accessible education to every child at every level of education. As an initial matter, I urge the new president and the Secretary of Education to recruit a strong management team at the department, one that is committed to taking a very close look at the department's organizational structure to determine if a more efficient and collaborative organization can be implemented quickly without detracting from the important substantive work ahead. Eliminating excessive stovepiping, for example, limits the ability of many offices and divisions in the department to work together and reinforces the tendency of some programs to work in isolation, a situation that stymies innovation and effective program administration, which are crucial in times of severe economic stress that affects education, both at the local and state level and in private school settings. The Secretary should establish a few unified priority areas and establish cross-cutting policy and programmatic teams to advance those areas. I advocate the establishment within the office of a single senior officer, the Undersecretary, for example, a requirement that that officer be charged with driving an integrated education reform agenda covering policy and practices from pre-K through college. The Secretary should immediately begin to develop an open dialogue with critical stakeholders at all levels of government, social entrepreneurs, and with business, education, civic, and nonprofit communities to develop and implement a consultative and collaborative framework for producing federal, state, and public-private partnerships that will help to build consensus around an agenda of effective education reform initiatives. The chapter also advocates that the President and Secretary can and should make more effective use of the bully pulpit and seek more creative ways to leverage limited federal education funds to accomplish several critical objectives in the following areas. The reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or the No Child Left Behind, as it is currently called, in order to strengthen its accountability provisions. The new reauthorization should provide for multiple and reliable measures of student progress, the enhancement of state and local capacity to use technology more effectively in order to collect and analyze student data more efficiently and effectively. That will permit the crafting of different and hopefully more effective strategies for schools needing improvement, strategies that are based on effective data-driven decision-making. Improvement of teacher quality is key, as is more equitable distribution of excellent teachers, especially in schools serving poor children and children with the most significant educational needs. The federal government and the department should support innovative programs and incentives designed to improve the overarching student-teacher experience in a quality management setting. This type of improvement, linking teaching to the improvement of the management setting in which classrooms are set, this type of improvement is essential if we expect teachers to perform to the best of their abilities. Investments must be made in properly designed and executed pre-service teacher education programs and effective and sustained professional development opportunities for teachers and school leaders. States and school districts should be encouraged to develop and adopt performance-based compensation systems and other incentives for rewarding high-quality performance. The Secretary also should make much more effective and transparent use of the Secretary's waiver authority to stimulate innovation and research to improve teacher and learning. Federal law does permit the Secretary to waive certain statutory and regulatory requirements to provide state and local governments with the flexibility they need to implement innovative practices and to meet the unique learning needs of some of their students. The chapter, as I mentioned earlier, does advocate the expanded use of the Secretary's bully pulpit to drive, among other things, high school reform that requires real accountability for raising graduation rates and the implementation of meaningful educational growth requirements for all students regardless of race, ethnicity, English language skills, or ability. Finally, the President and the new Secretary should make clear that the Civil Rights Monitoring, Compliance, and Enforcement Authority of the Department is still a critical responsibility of the federal government. During the last 8 years, many have described the Office for Civil Rights as either missing in action or pursuing a negative agenda that discouraged legally permissible efforts to enhance racial and ethnic diversity in schools and colleges. This chapter ends with a recommendation that the Department pursue as a longer-term agenda the elimination of the disparities in school funding that currently exist among states. The recommendation is based on a comprehensive study and analysis developed by Professor Goodwin Liu at the University of California, Berkeley, who argues that these disparities are less the result of the willingness of states to spend and more a matter of capacity. He argues that only federal intervention will address this barrier to equal educational opportunity in the least wealthy states, which also happen to be the states with a large percentage of poor and minority children who are most in need of educational services. The recommendations in the chapter as a whole are a huge challenge for any administration to tackle, but it is especially so in these perilous economic times. However, the quality of our nation's schools and equitable access to quality education are critical cornerstones of our national security, our future economic prosperity, and our ability to compete globally. When placed in this context, I find it hard to accept that we cannot make the commitments and particularly the investments required. They certainly are not beyond our means in the context that I've just addressed.
Terrific. Thank you very much. So let me just explain how we're going to proceed. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to answer just one question, the same question, about how they move forward. And then we're going to invite questions from the media about the book as a whole. And then when we've completed that, we'll invite questions from the general audience about the issues that are here. Jean had to leave, but about the broader economic agenda as well. And then we will try to end this panel so that we can keep moving on in the scheduled time allowed. We have a long program of terrific people we want to show their work. Let me just ask Michael and Judith, each of you talked about things that require essentially really fundamental changes, really huge reforms to systems that we think we're kind of at this sort of end of an era and we need to redesign the areas that we're working on. Yet the capacity of a new administration to move in such overwhelming reform ways simultaneously on so many different fronts is a very large challenge. No one would suggest that they can afford not to proceed apace in each of these areas. But it is also the case that your recommendations highlight what I call emblematic ideas, pieces that they can move forward with that show the goals of where they're trying to accomplish, but that can perhaps be done quickly, not necessarily requiring large comprehensive reform to make its way through Congress, but that shows people the direction that the President intends to take the country. And I'd ask if you could each see if you agree that a combination of working on the large redesign in parallel with moving forward in smaller bore reform makes sense, and if so, give one or two examples of that approach.
Sure. Well, I'd say, given the complexity of the task at hand, the first thing the president should do is hire you and Michelle to run the government for him, because I'm sure it'll get done a lot faster. In terms of initiatives that can be done now, I think that one, we need to use all the existing authorities at Treasury's disposal to help modify home mortgage loans. And there are enormous existing authorities, guarantee authorities, purchase authorities, modification authorities, authorities to pay servicers, authorities using the role of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, a portion of which was undertaken yesterday. But much more could be done using the GSEs and FHA. And so I think the first thing is a full court press on helping troubled homeowners. The second thing I'd highlight is regulatory reform of the mortgage market. The Federal Reserve has taken some initial steps in this area this year. after Chairman Greenspan for years and years denied that the Fed had the authority to take any action. Chairman Bernanke, to his credit, stepped in and has started a process of mortgage reform. We have enormous additional authority that we can do there to help clean up the mortgage market. So I would highlight those two as areas where we can proceed immediately while we look to these broader reforms.
Judith?
Yes, it is a daunting prospect that we have before us. In the field of education, I think it's important, first of all, to remember how many moving parts there are to trying to provide the kind of support that will increase student achievement, make excellent schools more accessible to students across the board, to make college more affordable and accessible. I do think that there are, certainly in the elementary, secondary area, some things that could be considered quite, could be considered and implemented. For example, I mentioned the use of the Secretary's waiver authority under the Elementary Secondary Education Act, which provides a secretary with the opportunity to let states and school districts use existing resources to try some innovative ways to increase student achievement. For example, one of the things that might do is to permit school districts that believe that they can move students forward without having them engaged in what some consider the quite rigorous and perhaps inflexible accountability system of testing, and to provide them with the waiver from that system in exchange for some innovations that then could, if successful, be used in other places and cut down both on expense and what some see as believe as not the best way of judging how well students are doing. Another area in which I think we could move education practice along in a way that affects results significantly is to begin to look at the education research opportunities across government, not only in the Department of Education, but there's research being funded by the National Science Foundation, by NASA, particularly in the STEM areas, to begin to have some interagency cooperation about how, what areas of research need to be supported, but more importantly, in my view, or as important, I suppose, is to try to figure out how to move this research into the field. Rather than making it an academic exercise, as unfortunately it is in many circumstances, so that we really begin to get the benefit of new knowledge in the classroom to produce the kind of results that we think are important. So those are just a couple of examples that I can think of.
Terrific examples of how we can both do practical, specific things quickly and move ahead on this very broad reform agenda. And for our audience, I just wanted to say that if STEM is not a familiar term, science, technology, engineering, and math, also talked about a great deal in the innovation chapter in the book. All right, so I've been given new instructions. My new instructions, I think we're going to actually focus a couple questions from the audience on the economic program laid out in the book, and then we will turn to the larger questions about the book and its meaning, and that'll be a nice segue because Mark will be chairing the next panel. So I would ask that anyone who has a question to raise your hand, and then if you would identify your name and any organization that you work with, and wait for the mic to arrive. First, the woman with a collar, and then the gentleman behind her.
Hi.
Please stand up.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi. I'm Olivia Golden. I want to also say thank you to the CAP crew because I'm one of the co-authors with Joan Lombardi, who I'm not sure is here, of one of the web-only chapter on the other HHS, on HHS's role in the economic program and early childhood. I'm currently at the Urban Institute. And I guess I had a question for Jean, who's not there, but also the other panelists, because a couple of the themes that struck us in our look at the workforce, economic security, family piece of HHS and the early childhood piece also, I think, came up in your comments. And those were a couple of themes about what's gone wrong and therefore what are early strategies. One is that the relationship with the states in many, which are crucial to moving in health and economic security and education, we identified a number of early steps to making that better, but we also noted that the crisis in state budgets makes that difficult, and we identified that as an early priority, as an area where there needs to be movement. Second, on the research front, which I think Judith just mentioned, we were struck that there is a lot of research available now which was done and buried in the last 8 years, and then part of a new relationship with an active positive agenda is to bring it out. A big example on the early childhood side is research about Head Start and early Head Start that shows successful outcomes and the ways you get to those outcomes that could now be shared to move the early childhood agenda. So I'm curious about those two themes and whether they also come up across the economic security agenda.
And then invite other comments. I think you will find that both of those come up in any number of places. And let me just mention, emphasize the point you made about the condition of state governments. The new president desperately needs our states as partners. In many cases, we're seeing innovations coming out of the states that we have great opportunity to expand upon, but that can't continue to happen if what we're seeing happening to our states fiscally continues. One of the priorities that the book was written before this became as pressing as is today, but that our organization is very focused on, is as part of an economic stimulus and recovery package, having a little greater federal support for the state governments so that the consequences of their retrenchment, remember they can't borrow now for later, the consequences of their retrenchment don't cause us to further spiral economically. And one of the key areas there is healthcare and making sure that they don't feel compelled to pull back on the level of coverage that they have, and then ironically, during the early part of a new president's administration, we go backwards, which is certainly what we're at risk of for the economy. I also want to mention your point about using information technology and using research and education. We call it data-driven government. It is so much the case that we need to restore America's confidence in the government that we have. After a 30-year program by conservatives to convince the public that government was the problem, not the solution to so many issues, the Bush administration seemed to prove the point with more exclamation than you could have imagined. And so while there may have been a rejection of a conservative governing agenda, I don't think there's been a broad transformation in the public's attitudes about the government. That I think their goals and objectives they want to see served, but they're really not sure how to get it done. And so we need to be willing to look hard and long at priorities shared by progressives and conservatives and make choices, first of all, that our priorities are the things that will matter most in getting us moving again and getting us moving in the long term, whether or not there are incumbent interests that support these programs and priorities. And second of all, that we're willing to put on the table things that are nice, well-intended, maybe even do some good, but don't do as much good as other things that we could be using our resources for. And the research that you talked about, just as in cost-effective health care that Jean talked about, Judy mentioned as well, central themes that you see coming out of the book.
I want to first of all, I want to thank Olivia for raising those issues. And if I had not been so intimidated by Sarah's passing me, you're out of time, I would have included in my remarks the fact that the chapter does urge the new administration to strengthen our commitment for universal early childhood education as a means of ensuring the greatest return on investment. And I think we do need to consider, those opportunities, if missed, can never be recovered. And so there is lots of research. Olivia is the most knowledgeable about this, about what it means to have early childhood learning occurring even before the age of 3. And if we miss the opportunity, those kids, those children really will not be making the same kind of progress that they could without it. So I think it's very important to think of priorities in that way, return on investment, and the ability to recover the opportunities.
Susie, a gentleman had his hand up back. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Terry Basilick with Freddie Mac. I'm intrigued by Michael's idea to apply the lessons of behavioral economics to use and kind of steer people towards clear, safe, transparent 30-year fixed mortgages in the absence of opt-out. As you know, that requires a vibrant secondary market. And around the world, research has shown that typically doesn't make 30-year fixed mortgages of the U.S. style broadly available to consumers in the absence of government involvement, which in this country has taken the form of the GSEs. I wonder what role your proposal envisions for something like the GSEs.
No, Terry, that's a great question and comment. I think that you're right that the empirical evidence internationally suggests that it's quite difficult for financial systems to generate a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. It's certainly difficult to do at reasonable loan-to-value ratios. It's hard to do without introducing prepayment penalties. It's hard to do with a broad access, and it's hard to do in a financial crisis. It's hard to do in regional economic downturns. There are a number of reasons why having such a system is quite fragile, and that's the one of the reasons why I think, as we're thinking about what to do with Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the Federal Home Loan Bank System, FHA, and our set of financial services reforms, we ought to have a set of principles that guide our choices among the options about how to structure those institutions going forward. And to me, at least, the important principle is that we have broad access, that we have access to a product like the 30-year fixed rate, no prepayment, reasonable LTV mortgage, that we have a system that is robust in financial crises, and that we have a system that's robust in regional economic downturns. And so for me, those would be the guiding principles in deciding among the trade-off in structures that you described.
The two questions we just had in many ways suggest the kind of richness that this book provides. Obviously, rather different fields of inquiry, a rather different audience in some ways. There are many layers of both program-specific and details here, but what I think unites them is what we talked about at the beginning. But in many ways, both the education agenda that Judith laid out and the reforms to the housing finance system are about restoring the American dream, making it possible for families to get ahead, for people to have better futures for their children. And so while I hope this is to be well mined by the people moving into the administration and the economic program in the new administration, and I look forward to watching that here from my post at CAP, I also believe that the larger objectives that we laid out in essence are woven through these very detailed technical chapters. So what I think we're going to do is invite Mark and Michelle to come up. We'll stay here to just to make the transition easy, and we're going to invite any other questions that either the media have or then the public about the book as a whole and the book project. And again, please wait for the microphone to come to you. Do we have any questions about the book?
There's no questions. We'll save time for our
Exactly.
panels.
We'd be more than happy to move on to other. It's coming right to you.
Hi, this is Sam Stein with the Huffington Post. Just a very basic, broad question is how much or how frequently do you think the Obama campaign, the Obama transition team is going to use this book? Are you going to get it to their attention? Have you had any collaboration with them on this besides Podesta before he recused himself, obviously?
Yeah, I'll answer that question. We have not shared this with any campaign, either the McCain campaign or the Obama campaign. The project started a year ago, focused on providing advice and ideas to whoever won. We shared some early drafts as a C4 institution to the Obama transition, and we will certainly make it available now, the final version, now that we have a final version. It's published first today, but we look forward to sharing it. And again, we're excited about the opportunity to be able to have all of these broad, rich set of ideas across many different areas that we can help inform and guide the transition.
We had the idea that when you pool experts like on the first panel and the other three into one-stop shopping volume, it would have two enormous benefits. In the short term, as Sam asked and Michelle commented on, it would give ideas to a transition to a new president of what they could do when the president-elect becomes president. The second goal, however, over time is to establish benchmarks of reform in the first day, so-called 100 days, a little anachronistic, but we all use it, first term, first year, and then first term. And so it's not a transition is not simply, it certainly is 77 days until January 20th, but this thousands of hours into one volume, the benefit of it doesn't stop at noon on January 20th, because then the agencies, Congress, the media, the public will be saying, in terms of bad mortgages or bad schools, so what have they done? So these are ideas for the transition and benchmarks for the future. Now that this is the formal release, so we're happy to send it to any president-elect in America and his or her transition team that is interested in reading it.
Hi, I'm Nate Lowenthal from the Roosevelt Institution. There's a debate right now between people who think that the president should act very quickly and do as much stuff as humanly possible and put forward an incredibly bold agenda, and they pull from kind of one historical example, and then other people are saying, no, it needs to be a little more incremental, take it a little bit slower, don't put a huge amount of pressure on the 100 days period, and they pull from other historical examples. So I'm wondering, as people who work so hard on this project, how bold an agenda and how quickly should the president-elect try to act when he gets into office? And beyond economic stimulus, what should be the first priority between all the competing ideas you've put forward?
Well, no one of us can speak for all of us. Unlike a transition team where one guy can and will speak for the whole entity, we are individuals who have come together for this use of the transition and then for benchmarks. Now, speaking for myself, I do think there's a new mainstream in America. I saw Newsweek had a cover article about 3 weeks ago. Welcome to conservative, President-elect Obama, welcome to conservative America. I believe this is a stale, left-right analysis that has been undone by what happened November 4th. I don't know an issue on choice, the environment, economic, financial regulation, where the public has become more conservative in the last few years. And if George W. Bush didn't win a majority of the vote in 2000 and felt he had a strong mandate, and then George W. Bush won by under 3 million votes in 2004 and felt he had a strong mandate and had political capital he would spend, I think statistically and historically, Barack Obama, with a nearly 8 million vote margin, will have a mandate for change that only he can figure out tactically, whether he moves early and strong for a few things or for more of a laundry list of things. Progressives don't go through life listless, so we have all these lists, and I understand that. But what we try to do is the equivalent of what conservatives have done. They have successfully run and governed on less taxes, less government. That's pretty succinct. Progressives are more wordy, and so we can't get it down to 4 words, but we came close, which is democracy, diplomacy, economic opportunity, and a greener world. And those 4 themes, values, actually can be integrated into, as the next panel will discuss, a new democracy. And so if Ronald Reagan talked about and ran on and governed according to freedom, which was his bellwether word that everything related to, in his view, a new president could do well to talk about democracy as an umbrella for all the issues, from schools to economic opportunity and growth, and all the panels.
And if I could just make one quick point. I'm sorry, Michelle.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing, which is the president obviously is going to have an overarching agenda, but each individual agency is able to take steps. Each secretary or head of an agency will be able to do things first day in office, first 100 days. Our book and each of the chapters suggests some of those things that agencies can do that will start changing our government and moving it into a progressive direction.
The only thing I wanted to add is that I think there's a little bit of a false choice in this media discussion right now. Somehow or other, the president has to govern from the center and go slow, or he has to be bold and have change. I think the American public was crystal clear. This was an election about issues, not just a rejection of particular candidates. There was a discussion about the energy transformation. There was a discussion about our health care. There was a discussion about economic opportunity and a discussion about our role in the world and ending wars. And there is no doubt that the American people want to see bold action in those areas. That doesn't mean that you're not pragmatic and you don't sit down and you don't work with everyone to make those solutions. That doesn't mean that you have to operate the way the Bush administration operated with its so-called mandate, in which it said our way or no way, and we're not willing to talk to anybody else who doesn't agree. So I think that this discussion needs to be had about what we're trying to achieve, no holding back, and how we do it, which is bringing people together and work around pragmatic, specific solutions, which we hope we've contributed here.
Yes, ma'am. Okay.
Hi, thanks a lot. I'm Dio Lopate with the Root. My question, I guess, has to do with thematics. I know that there are some unknowns. The financial crisis happened in September. I know that you were, Mark, reading pages through mid-October. To what extent have you tried to sort of deal with this question of not having the money to spend, not having enough space in your budget, right? I know this is becoming a rather persistent theme. And how has your book, in an overarching sense, tried to make a case that this is an imperative, whatever strategies that you've put forward, and to sort of cut back against the new presumption that there might not be space or time or cash for any of this?
3 points. First, as Judith indicated, most of the chapters were developed over the last year and completed this fall, before September 15th, when the credit and economic crisis really hit full gale force. And because there's no one OMB or one president-elect overseeing all this, it'd be presumptuous for any one of us to say, oh, Chapter 4 is, we have to spend X dollars rather than Chapter 16. Having said that, there is an enormous Keynesian consensus that this government will have to spend money in the short term for what is called an economic stimulus or economic investment, although parties and philosophies may disagree exactly how to do it. And so there will be more spending, both to encourage consumer demand to get the economy going again. And finally, the question before about how fast to move and liberal or conservative, this is not a static situation. Something happened November 4th. And if you look at 06 and 08, there's been a provable shift. And a president is a teacher-in-chief, not just a commander-in-chief. And so when a president talks about taxes and terrorism, the public learns lessons and responds. And if a new teacher-in-chief says, what's liberal or conservative about more insurance for children, ending torture, not invading country on the wrong premises, more transparency, those are not left, right, Democrat, Republican issues necessarily. So the question, in my view, is there's a transition between presidencies. Is there a transition between eras? And there's the potential for that.
I think we're going to end the program here now. I just mentioned that at 1 o'clock today there'll be a program that'll also be broadcast on C-SPAN that CAP's putting up on about some of those questions as well.
So let's invite the
Maria?
democracy.
The panelists for the democracy panel to please come up and join Mark. Thank you very much.